to keep 15 minutes time limit. Ladies and gentlemen, the history of Europe in 20th century was unfortunately marked by two world wars, many violent conflicts, totalitarian regimes and dictatorships, and the numerous mass crimes committed by them. In almost every corner of Europe, we can still find literal or metaphorical wounds. We all know that this past can present a danger to the process of European integration, especially if misused or if we ignore problems relating to this part of our history. But during the panel, we would like to discuss the matter of healing those wounds, how to address problems rooted in the past, and how to do it while also remembering, honoring the victims, strengthening reconciliation efforts, and leaving a clear message to the future generations. The resolution of the European Parliament of 19 September 2090 stressed the importance of European remembrance for the future of Europe. One of the initiators of this resolution is our first speaker of today, Ms. Juknevičienė, who also established the informal group of MIPs supporting the implementation of the resolution. Ms. Juknevičienė, our virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Oh, I am sorry, it's something wrong with the video. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Yes, so dear participants, in my presentation, I will try mainly to draw your attention on the European Parliament resolution, which was already mentioned. The resolution with the title on the importance of European remembrance for the future of Europe. It was adopted in European Parliament September last year, and we put the understanding on how can European history heal the wounds of the past. But first of all, I would like shortly to introduce myself and explain my interest in remembrance topic. I come from Lithuania. This is my first term as a member of the European Parliament and first intervention, by the way, in your forum. I am proud to be with you today. But I have been an active politician since the restoration of Lithuania's independence in 1990. Like very many other families, generations of my family, my parents, my grandparents, had the same mission: to preserve the history of our country for the future through their children. We spent a large part of our lives in occupied Lithuania, where history was fabricated and concealed, hidden. Falsification of history was a cornerstone of the rule of the Soviet Empire. My brothers and I, we learned our history from the stories that our mother and grandmother told us about their life in Siberia, where they lost half of their family. Those stories saved our minds from drawing in the Soviet lies. Many families in my country did the same, but full understanding of our history took much longer. Even after we regained our freedom, we needed time to open our hearts and comprehend the full horror of the Holocaust that took place in occupied by Nazis Lithuania. We needed time to acknowledge the cruelty with which the Soviet regime crushed the partisan resistance in the forest of Lithuania. The resistance that was and still is so little known in Europe, but which was also hidden from Lithuanians by Soviets. Only recently have we discovered and properly reburied the bodies of our resistance fighters and leaders. But now it is the time to acknowledge our European history as history of all of us. As a member of European Parliament, I see the question of European historical memory as one of my priorities. I started my first term at the European Parliament right before the 80th anniversary of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The idea to initiate the European Parliament resolution commemorating this day that was so important for the history of all Europe came during conversation with Tune Kelam. I think all of you know him very well, an Estonian politician that had finished his term at the European Parliament last year. Today we have an official EU document that we can rely on when we talk about the importance of history for the future of Europe. How can European history heal the wounds of the past, or when we are faced with disinformation that aims to distort it? The 19th of September 19 resolution of European Parliament was adopted by 535 votes in favor. It is important to remind that European Parliament adopted the resolution with similar content on 2009. Looking from historical approach, one of the main provisions in the text of the new resolution, which is mentioned for the first time in the history of resolutions, is this, I quote, "Treaty of Non-Aggression, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and its secret protocols dividing Europe and the territories of independent states between the two totalitarian regimes and grouping them into spheres of interest, paved the way for the outbreak of the Second World War." This sentence was the main reason why this resolution was noticed by Kremlin. The resolution became the focus point of Vladimir Putin on December 2019. We understood that with this document, we damaged a huge historical attack that was prepared to the 75th anniversary of the victory of World War II. If not the pandemic, this date had to be celebrated with pompous parades and the participation of Western leaders assessing the victory according to Stalin's historical doctrine. According to the plan, not only Russia's public sphere, but also EU public sphere had to be filled with Stalinist World War II narrative. I was really surprised at first that Kremlin's attack against European Parliament resolution was directed towards Poland and Polish members of parliament, although the original text was born in Lithuania in the computer of my assistant. Most probably the Kremlin missed the beginning of the resolution's preparatory work, and some small Lithuanians seemed not significant at all. When I was gathering the necessary support to the idea and adoption of resolution, Latvians, Bulgarians, Romanians, and of course Polish joined the process. Their amendments were very important. It seems that the attack against Poland was directed because it was necessary to find a weapon to deny the most important provision of resolution, that World War II was started by the agreement of both dictators, both totalitarian regimes. This provision was written in the preliminary text of resolution, and during the debates of European Parliament, it has not received any critique or doubts. It was adopted without amendments. This indicates that for the most representatives of EU countries in the Parliament, such provision does not raise any doubts. Important. Hopefully, Putin's attempts to erase obvious facts will not resonate in Europe. So the elevation of communism and Nazism, as well as the statement that World War II was begun by both Hitler and Stalin, are the most inconvenient, inappropriate to the different World War II narrative planned by the Kremlin. According to them, Soviets must be regarded as the only anti-fascists, and those who don't agree with such story, fascists. All states in the neighborhood with Russia are in the spike of Russia's disinformation using history attacks. That's why it was very important to adopt resolution with overwhelming majority and to send very clear message that we are united. However, the most important target is Russia's society and especially youth. At home, the Russian political leadership takes aim not only at the Soviet nostalgic electorate, but also at the younger generation. They are to be trained in a nationalistic, imperialistic ideology, including a hostile view of the West. Those who control the past control the future. This is the motto of Kremlin. Stalin's role is being heroized. The crimes of that period are not only justified, but also elevated. It's important to see it and act anonymously, because the silence of democratic world will cultivate even bigger aggression. Could anyone imagine monuments built to Hitler in Germany? Most certainly not. However, such monuments to Stalin are being built in Russia. Communist crimes have not been condemned as Nazi crimes. Therefore, Stalinism is returning to Russia in other aggressive forms. It is not too late to think about the special tribunal on communist crimes as well. We are being tested how far Kremlin can go with history falsification attacks. Until time comes when Russia evaluates its history as Germany did, World War II or Ribbentrop-Molotov dividing lines will remain alive on the European continent. The distinguished feature of those lines is the spaces of democracy and autocracy in European continent. Today's events in Belarus also demonstrate this. By the way, Moldova is the newest example. Pro-European president Maya Sandu was elected against pro-Soviet former president, and Moldova, by the way, was a subject of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. However, Russia itself continues to suffer the most from Soviet totalitarianism, failing in any way to overcome the blackest tumors in its history. The resolution also contains an important sentence on this. I quote, "Russia remains the greatest victim of communist totalitarianism, and that its development into democratic state will be impeded as long as the government, the political elite, and political propaganda continue to whitewash communist crimes and glorify the Soviet totalitarian regime." And resolution calls, therefore, on Russian society to come to terms with this tragic past. Russia's misinformation war against EU states using the history is necessary and possible to stop if the EU has a strong common understanding that European history is not just Western European history. We celebrate 8th of May as the day of most important victory in the 20th century. Yes, it's true. With the end of World War II, the bloody Holocaust ended. However, the big part of what is now the EU has sunk into the darkness of communism, with millions of people still tortured in Stalin's camps after the war. No one has ever liberated them in the way Auschwitz was liberated. And so far, no EU leader has laid flowers anywhere in Norilsk or Krasnoyarsk. A clear strategy is needed so that history is not used as a weapon against the EU. We need to have an ambitious plan for history teaching at schools, as called for in the resolution adopted by the European Parliament. We therefore need to make the EU not only a common economic market, not only a common space for those traveling without borders, but also a common space for our different historical experiences and memories. In the EP, we set up an informal remembrance group. We recently had a virtual meeting with Vera Jourova, Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency. We agreed to work together to implement the key provisions of the resolutions. I thank organizers for the opportunity to speak at this conference and recall that the European resolution also contains the following sentence: It calls on the Commission to provide effective support for projects of historic memory and remembrance in the member states, and for the activities of the Platform of European Memory and Conscience, and to allocate adequate financial resources under the European for Citizens program to support commemoration and remembrance of the victims of totalitarianism, as set out in Parliament's position on the 21-27 Rights and Values program. I wish to all of us to heal the wounds of the past, and this conference, I think, will help to do that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, for sharing your personal experience, but also the East Central European perspective on this issue, and many insights connected with the resolution and the current situation, which proves us how important the past still is, also on the level of international politics. Thank you very much once more. Mr. Jahir, your Renaissance program was focused on solving current problems we face in Europe and providing some solutions for a better future. But when we ask you as a president of European Economic and Social Committee to be one of the organizers of the conference originally planned for May this year, you accepted this without any hesitation. So I think you see a kind of connection between the past and the current situation, the future for Europe. Please share with us your perspective.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizer, and a very warm hello to my friend Ariakowski, with whom I started to discuss on this concept. I remember that we met the first time in Krakow 20 years ago in a sort of debate exactly between the two hangs of Europe. Thank you for this invitation, and many congratulations to the organizer for this series of events on the past for the future of Europe. Which narrative do we need to unite Europe today? Of course, as you mentioned, our original joint proposal was to host this event in Brussels in May in the premises of the ESC, but the pandemic obliged us to postpone this, and I am more than delighted, although I finished my presidency, to be with you today, and even the ESC to be a co-sponsor of this event. In view of this occasion, allow me to take a step back and frame my contribution in an historical and cultural perspective. Last week, we commemorate again two main events of our common history. The first is the 102nd anniversary of the end of the World War I, which armistice didn't conclude the tension and the war, but opened the Pandora vase to a century of division, war, destruction, and even to this last longing division in two of Europe that was remembered by the eminent member of the parliament before. And the second one was the 31st anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so let me to say that this dismantling of borders allowed Europe to grow together, to reunify what was unified before, and to further the project of unification, peace, and prosperity, unprecedented time of peace and unprecedented prosperity for this part of the world. Many reasons has been put forward for this peaceful revolution that started in Poland, in the Baltic countries, in Hungary, and finally with the Berlin Wall fall, including Gorbachev political shift, economic challenges, inner party struggles within the leading party of the GDR, and the mass exodus of young, mainly young, qualified citizens, the neighboring country, for example, Hungary, through the Sopot border, that was the first one to be opened Yet the actual drivers which push tens of thousands of citizens to protest and dream a new future are more often organized civil society, as we see even today in Belarus. Civil society movement and churches which encourage engagement, offer the platform for joint action, and articulate the citizens' demand. For it is indeed true, Europe was and it is still driven from the bottom up. However, 31 years later, the borders and barriers of the mind and also physical border remain strong, both within Germany, both inside and both between the countries of Europe. And such barriers have a great impact on our European Union, its economy, social tissue, cultures, restricting our freedom of thought, of dreaming next, and ultimately our capacity of action. During my mandate as ESC president, I decided in the framework of this Renaissance program of the presidency to initiate a series of visits on borders and peace in Europe. Berlin was the third of this series in the 30th anniversary, which brought me first to Belfast, Northern Ireland, where a division in the country, a division in the city of Belfast, a wall that is closed in the night still exists, highlighted the relevance of this border in the still ongoing Brexit drama and the very real threat of the reigniting intra-community conflict. I then traveled to Sopron, Hungary, the site of the Pan-European picnic 31 years ago, commemorating the opening of the Austro-Hungarian border. And then I concluded after Berlin my journey in Nicosia, Cyprus, another very painful divided land in Europe, which fences and military occupation are still there. And we are testimony of the last week visit of the President Erdogan in the North Cyprus just to reestablish this division. For barriers of all sorts still exist. At the beginning of my presidency, in the end of May 2018, I promoted a fresh start of my mandate in Krakow. For I was convinced that we need to make more of an effort to help Europe breathe with its eastern and western lung. We started a seminar in the Jagiellonica University, and in the end we went to Auschwitz. We have done, I think, a poor job to reconcile our collective historical memories in Europe. We have created a huge single market, a strong single market, a common currency, even a shared democratic ruling. But it seemed that we have failed after the reunification of Central and Eastern European countries in our EU family to create a common shared approach to Europe past based on the foundation of European core values such as humanism, tolerance, solidarity, and mainly value and ruling of democracy. In this sense, I remember well the resolution of the European Parliament that was quoted by Raza just before, and I was when it was approved, I was supporting as president. But I also remember that when I went to my bureau, there was some part of the bureau, mainly from some Western countries, was opposing my support to this resolution. So this means that this reconciliation of memory, this capacity to look in a common way, putting together all the both point of view in our Europe is still far from there. These barriers exist not only between East and West of Europe, but also between the South and North of Europe, driven by actual disparities and the feeling of being left behind and not heard, or left alone to manage EU borders and migration flows, as is not so high in the perception today, but the postponing again of the Dublin reform and the migration issue will perhaps refuel in the south of Europe this sentiment after the pandemic wave. I think that we have many current threats to democracy in Europe today. And while we are glad in the recent European Parliament election turnout was higher than previously, we can surely say that there was something more at stake than the turnout. There is still rising authoritarianism, nationalism, and populism threaten the values around which the European project was built. If the fears about an increase of the populist vote after the parliament dominated by it revealed to be wrong, we have stopped the populists in the election, but they have not been defeated. We need still to be very aware of the danger that if this is not ruled out forever. Many of our citizens still simply do not believe anymore in the European project, nor for they think that you can improve their lives or the ones of their children. The survey carried out by the Brussels-based think tank Friend of Europe, it was before the pandemic, revealed that 60% of Europeans are not sure they would miss the EU if it were gone. Of course, it was before the pandemic. Today, after the pandemic, the two words more core in the European sentiment are Europe and health. And also there is a large recognition and a very low voice of the sovereignist that Europe has done a lot to respond to face the emergency and to plan for the future. But look, no one was expecting realistically a second and perhaps a third wave of the pandemic. And there are large, very difficulties to put in place the large and impressive and unprecedented measure decided in such a short time with such consensus by European institutions. And if this will continue, I fear that after the spring, perhaps at the end of the next year, this sovereignist divisive mood will raise again, and perhaps Europe will become the main point of attack for its incapacity to deliver. It will be very useful to be done. Dear colleague, you probably remember Germany's vow after the Second World War, which consisted of never again. This never again means never again alone, as German President Steinmeier explained very well in his outstanding speech remembering the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe in May this year, where he qualified Germany and also Europe today as still a broken heart. And this sentence is nowhere so true as in Europe. We must keep Europe together. We must think, feel, and act as Europeans, especially during and after this pandemic. It is hitting worldwide so hard. If Europe fails, the never again alone also fails, warned President Steinmeier. I therefore glad that after years of discussion, a deal was eventually struck over a new mechanism linking EU funds to respect to rule of law criteria, although we know that two countries are still questioning this rule of law mechanism in the final approval of the EU budget. The agreement is timely and balanced and will help moving the European project forward and contribute strongly to improve citizens' reliance on EU values and principles. And here I think that civil society role is crucial, and it has the power to unite memories, drive participation and engagement in democratic processes. We need to nurture democracy by coming closer to citizens and listening to their requests, fears, hopes, and expectations. We need them to be active part of the shaping and making of political decisions. This is true at all levels, be the local, the national, and the European. But I would say that this is especially true at European level. Only then will they feel included in the EU processes and will say that the EU is worth fighting for. Only then will they have the feeling of gaining back control. This required ushering in a new era of permanent direct involvement of civil society, designed to enhance the European identity and generate interest among citizens. In addition and complementary to existing mechanisms and institutions. Here comes the importance of ensuring appropriate political and social channels that can articulate, aggregate, and convey interest, demands, and points of view. Here comes the role of local and regional authorities on one side and of civil society organization on the other, driving Europe from the bottom up. And also the key role of those EU institutions that channel this voice, mainly the European Committee of Regions and the European Economic and Social Committee. The two committees with the Parliament have a crucial role to play, and we can say with no fears of being contradicted that we are the institution closer to the citizens. In this sense, I hope, and let me to say that once not being anymore the ESC president, I can be spoken even openly, that it's quite time to stop this quarreling about who has to chair the Conference on the Future of Europe and let us conference start, because this project was an outstanding project exactly to do this one. I think that I fully share with the President Michel that even now in the pandemic is more than crucial to have such a debate, although in different way as we can imagine 1 year ago, but it's time to start, not to continue to postponing this political joint declaration of the three main institutions to be able to start, because there is a word that defines when we miss the opportunity, too late. So not too late the decision to start when the division between citizens and institutions will come back to grow. I think that my time is limited, and so I will not to create the reaction of our moderator, and so I will go to the conclusion. I wish only to say that where borders has so often defined our identity in our history, they were also so often divided our society. And in time of crisis, where pain and fear arise, they have been so often used by sovereignist and extremists to push to dictatorship and even worse. On the contrary, we should put it at the core of our thinking and our action, our compassion towards broken hearts, leaving no one behind, repairing our society and our economy, and investing in EU Renaissance, following the very clear, very progressive, and unprecedented strong EU roadmap that has been proposed by the Commission von der Leyen and supported at large by the Parliament, the Council, and the two consultative institutions. Let us go in this direction, and let's also restart to think how to reconcile in deep the EU memories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially for presenting us the complexity of the issue, that we are not speaking only on this general division of European remembrance between, let's say, Western and Eastern part of our union, but there are many internal problems in some countries. You mentioned Ireland, but we could probably add, for example, Spain still dealing with the legacy of the past, but also forgotten experience, for example, of such countries as Cyprus. So thank you very much once more. Mr. De Grassi, European concept, as we know it, was based on very fresh historical experience. Of course, I am referring to Second World War, which pressed the European politicians to think about the necessity of integration to avoid future conflicts of this kind. But the question is, after 75 years after the war, is history still so important for us today? You are deeply involved in preparing already mentioned conference on the future of Europe. What is your perspective on the issue?
Thank you very much, President Kamiński, distinguished speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to everyone. On behalf of Vice President Šuica, I want to thank, first of all, the Collège de Bernardin, the Platform of European Memory and Conscience, and the European Economic and Social Committee for organizing this online conference. It is a great pleasure for me to contribute to this discussion with such high-level speakers. And if you allow me a personal note, I was a bit nostalgic when I received this invitation because my European path started years ago with an Erasmus program in Paris. And when I moved there, I found one of those incredibly tiny apartments that was literally around the corner from the Collège de Bernardin. So for me, it was a life-changing experience, and I would pass in front of the entrance of the college every single day. So it is a great pleasure to visit again this place, even if we are allowed to do it only virtually for now. So as the honorable member of the parliament and President Jair pointed out, the European Union is the result of the complex and sometimes painful past of its member states and citizens. Our common present is also characterized by new, unprecedented global challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, but also climate change, digitalization, and a demographic explosion predicted to increase the world's population to up to 10 billion by mid-century. These cannot be addressed in isolation, nor by any country alone. This is clear. So Europe must build its future together, based on the experience from its past and adapting to a fast-changing global environment. If we think about this COVID-19, we are all feeling its harsh economic, social, and psychological effects. But only 12 months ago, when the new Commission took office, none of us could have imagined this development at all. So this crisis has also shown us what we should value most in our union, namely the need for unity and solidarity in difficult times. At the Commission, believe me, we are making every effort not to waste this crisis, but rather find innovative ways to reinforce the connection between citizens and the democratic institutions that serve them, to protect and deepen our democratic values also. This goes hand in hand, of course, with human rights and the rule of law. However, as President Jair pointed out, we see more and more signs that democracy is having a hard time. We have disappointed citizens, the rise of extremism, increasing political polarization, the fairness of elections is under pressure, a deteriorating environment for journalists and civil society, and the exponential spread of false and misleading information. So our representative democracy works well, but it's not without fault. Some say it's not responsive enough, or it's too mechanical, or not inclusive enough. So should we get rid of it? Certainly not. Our history told us so, but we have to face the evidence that our society has changed and we need new thinking. Without forgetting our history, our past, our diversity, but quite the contrary, by making all our collective experience work together and getting creative about political participation. The objective of Vice President Šuica from day one in her role as Vice President responsible for democracy and demography has been to invest all her energy in citizen engagement and participation at all levels of policymaking. Prior to the COVID pandemic, she was on a listening tour and she visited in the first 2 months, I think 10 or 11 member states, always trying to go outside of the capitals, to rural areas and villages, to discuss with citizens and to listen to the great experiences they have to share. And wherever we went, we saw really a genuine desire of European citizens to engage more and have their say in what Europe does and how. So we are trying to answer this call, and there are many ways that we are engaging with this increased interest of citizens in European democracy. The first is the one that has been mentioned before and that I am mostly closely involved with, and that is the Conference on the Future of Europe. We are starting a deliberative democracy process at the EU level. This is aimed at strengthening our representative democracy and certainly not replacing it. We have never done this before at this large scale, so it is important that we get this right. For the first time, we will have citizens all across European Union that will get to have their say in policy making beyond European election. And this is not, of course, to say that voting is less important. Let us be clear, voting is even more important today than it was ever before. We mentioned the May European election last year, where we had more than half of eligible voters cast their ballots. And this was the best results in the past 2 decades. This is, of course, good news, but there is another side to those results that we should not ignore. More and more citizens feel left behind, and they started to blame democracy itself. Why did this happen? For me, it's because citizens often do not understand well the work that we do in Brussels. They feel that the European Union is also not something tangible in their lives, and yet it very much is. So it is vital that we reach out to citizens from all areas and all ages. This will be a key feature of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And I insist that we must engage also with those that are a bit critical of the European Union and those who do not usually engage with us. All citizens, all people must be included in this deliberative democracy exercise if we want to be serious. So inclusiveness will be our first principle. And the second one is openness, because it's important that people can discuss the topics that interest them with no red lines. Debates, of course, will be clustered around themes as per the EU headline ambitions, including the Commission's political guidelines and the European Council strategic agenda. But we want citizens to have the possibility to raise additional topics along the conference. Also, debates will have to take place at all levels, local, regional, national, and European levels, in different formats, being randomly selected citizens panels or plenary sessions or very local debates. We will put in place a mixture of physical, online, and hybrid events, of course, given the condition, so that everyone will have the possibility to participate, including via a new interactive pan-European and multilingual digital platform that will be the one-stop shop, let's say, for all the information on the conference. Most of all, we want citizens to see concrete and tangible results of their deliberation. Otherwise, the frustration will potentially increase. This will be really the measure of our success, and President von der Leyen was the first to commit to this in her political guidelines. Let me underline one critical thing, echoing what President Jair said before. We will only be successful if citizens, businesses, civil society, youth organizations, and decision makers, and many other partners will be strongly behind it and contribute as equal partners. And of course, we share the message of President Jair that we want to start as soon as possible. But to have everyone behind the conference, we need to start with a joint declaration of the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission that will set the basic principles, scope, and structure. And we hope this can be done soon. So as soon as we start, I would encourage you to seize this opportunity and get involved in this conference. Vice President Šuica definitely counts on your expertise and your energy. The conference is, however, not the only flagship project in the field of democracy. In a few weeks, the Commission will adopt an EU democracy action plan to address external intervention in EU elections and table legislative proposals to ensure more transparency in paid political advertising, for example, and clearer rules on the financing of political parties. More crucially, the action plan will support our working on countering disinformation and fake information, while preserving, of course, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and media pluralism that are so dear to us. I think strengthening democracy is key to get out of this crisis, move forward, and set the European Union back on a path of sustainable, fairer, and more resilient growth. This is a basis for the green and digital transition that we want to pursue. And it's also critical to manage and learn from the demographic change that Europe is experiencing and will ultimately affect the very way we live together. And let me conclude with some good news. As you know, the search for a COVID vaccine has been a priority for the Commission and all our member states in the past months, because a safe and effective vaccine is our best chance to beat Corona and return to our normal lives. We have worked tirelessly to secure doses of potential vaccines, and last week, the Commission authorized a contract for up to 300 million doses of the vaccine developed by German company BioNTech and Pfizer, which is the most promising so far. Meanwhile, we work with member states to prepare national vaccination campaigns. So we are almost there, hopefully, but for now, let us be prudent and stay safe. Also last week, the European Parliament, Council and Commission reached a historic political agreement on the next long-term budget and the next generation program for recovery. Once officially adopted, this will be the largest package ever financed through the EU budget, more than 1.8 trillion of Europe. Reaching an agreement on this was very important because so many other things depend on it. Next Generation EU will sustain the efforts of our member states and will bring the EU on a solid path to recovery, providing support in particular to those who suffered the most during this pandemic, including the elderly and children. These funds need to reach our citizens as speedily as possible, and we will spare no efforts, of course. Next Generation EU will be the demonstration of how we can build on EU solidarity to provide swift response at time of crisis. And it will be an excellent example of international solidarity, linking the past, the present, and the future to set our union on the recovery path we need to the benefit of all generations. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions that will come from the viewers.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Now we still have about 10 minutes for a discussion. So maybe I will start with a question to our panelists. If you would like to comment on each other presentation, maybe you have questions to other panelists. Are you willing to ask for something right now? Ms. Juknevičienė, please.
Thank you for the colleagues for their interventions. It was already mentioned by one of you about the different understanding. Even when we adopted the resolution, we also heard from historians, from other people about is it important or not? But my question will be related, and I will explain a little bit. Saying that in Lithuania, I often hear words of disappointment from my constituents that the West does not understand our history. But my answer always is, usually is, but do we in the European Northeast understand the history of the Spanish, Italian, or Greek while they lived under totalitarian regimes? Probably not. So myself, I see some gap among the countries, in between the countries, in between the people, about the history, which is utmost important to feel more united, to understand each other. So what would be your suggestions, your understanding, how it could help our new commission, not new, 1 year working commission, or what kind of programs we have to implement in order to understand each other, at least our younger generations, to have more common understanding?
Thank you very much. Before you will answer the question, my proposal is to collect all of them and then to start this series of answers. And I see that Mr. Antoine Ajarkowski, one of the co-organizers of this conference, would like to ask a question in person. So please do it right now.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear the speakers today. My question is the following. It's to Mattia De Grassi. What would be right now the plans for including history in the conference for the future of Europe? It is important, if we prepare the future, to know how to write history together. Without the past, we cannot build the future. So what are the plans today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one more question from one of our Facebook viewers, and it is addressed to all speakers. And the question is, how will EU accession policy, for example, in the Western Balkans, complicate the search for a common European narrative? For example, in the unresolved experience of the Balkan wars. So we have 3 questions, and I saw that Mr. Jahier already sent a signal that he would like to answer the first one. So please, the floor is yours.
I wish really to thank Raza for her question, because I think that is a crucial question. Of course, from one side, we cannot replace historian with political statement, and there are 2 different ways to read and to rewrite and to re-understand history in Europe. Not only the history of the huge division that was established after 1918, the Red Revolution, the October Revolution in Russia, and after the end of the Second World War, when it was agreed in Yalta to divide Europe in 2 and left on one side one part to allow the others to be free and to have a progress, and also on a deeper and longer period to re-understand what we call very often in the West, the East Europe is much more center of Europe, the heart of Europe, also from an historical point of view. The Lithuanian Empire I discovered during the Lithuanian presidency was one of the largest and one of the most fruitful empire in Europe, much more than others that we are used to study at school in the West School. But just to answer to you, I think that this issue of reconciliating memory is crucial. And it's crucial because although we do not give the same meanings to words, the same meaning even on the values that we have agreed in the Article 2 of the Treaty of the Union, that are the core of our being together and doing things together. And if I may, to go to some concrete proposals that are not new, I was one of the old sponsors of 2 ideas. First of all, an Erasmus for all. So I am glad that at the end, the negotiation between the European Parliament and the Council have re-established some progression in some for Erasmus. They are not enough, because with all the respect and the appreciation for Mrs. De Grassi, the sons of Erasmus are too few in Europe. We need to have a program of Erasmus for all. And I think we need also in the post-pandemic era to think to a European civil service compulsory for all, that push every citizens under 30 years old to pass at least 6 months of his life in another country, doing something, learning something, being in touch with others. Because memory are reconciled by historians, are reconciled by the work of politicians, are reconciled by action, but are reconciled also through the concrete relation between people. And this is a long-term engagement. Look at the work done, not still concluded, on the old divided border between France and Germany. All the work done after the Second World War, this joint youth program between Germans and France. So we need something like this. And we need a lot of research to understand how the different parts of Europe have seen what has happened in Europe in last century, have seen to the dream of Europe, and also can contribute in a different way to this dream. I think this will be essential just to give a sense also to all the discussion on the Article 7 of the treaty on the rule of law and all the sharing, the deep sharing of the core value of democracy. And just one word about the conference on the future of Europe. I was more than convinced with President Sassoli when we met in the mid of July that after the Council has established finally its joint common position, thanks to the good job done by the Croatian presidency at the end of June, it would have been more than possible to establish the joint political declaration that seems to be 2 pages, and to use the State of the Union event during the European Parliament plenary in September to give the official launch of the conference. Now we are in the mid of November. Very soon will be Christmas. Hope we will be capable to make some meeting with parents and friends during Christmas if the pandemic wave go down. So very soon we will be in January. We do expect, we need to expect that before the end of the German presidency, this political declaration is established, and using the last plenary session of the Parliament before the Christmas pause, there is an official start of this conference, although it will be in totally another format than the one planned 1 year ago. That's for sure, because the pandemic doesn't allow to have the citizen convention all around Europe with people convening and so on. But we have to let it start. If it is not possible to agree between the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission on 2 pages of political declaration, giving a mandate to a working group to establish the governance and the proceedings, I think we have a problem, just to be very clear and honest. And so we need to do this. I know it's not you that are blocking this. Perhaps we have to look much more in the Parliament to take an initiative in this sense. But I speak very freely in this moment. But we need to do this, although the signal will be very bad to engage in such a discussion, although the framework of discussion should be probably a little more adapted than the one imagined in December 2018 and January 2020, when the discussion was at the core and the Commission, the Parliament has established their framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We got a few extra minutes from the organizers to continue our panel, but I would appreciate the short answers from our speakers. Mr. De Grassi, there was a question directed to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll try to reply to the questions and comments. Of course, we think that the conference on the future of Europe will be a great tool for both the objectives of reconciling positions and also the question of what will be the role of history. What we are trying to do is to create an open space for a pan-European democratic debate. And this has never been done so far at this scale and is incredibly complex. Think only about what President Jair was mentioning about the language and the fact that some words have different meaning across Europe. But this is the only way, I mean, it's not the only way, but I think it's a very important tool that we can use to start a discussion and to co-create our future, starting as Mr. Arjakovsky mentioned, starting on the basis of our past, which are, of course, very important. But the most important thing, of course, is that we managed to start and set this right. President Jair mentioned that if the two institutions cannot agree on a political declaration, we have a problem. On our side, on the Commission side, we are very much ready and eager to start. Last month, Vice President went to the General Affairs Council in Luxembourg to invite the ministers to start as soon as possible this exercise. And I have to say that there was a lot of willingness, especially from the German presidency, and a strong commitment to do start. Of course, the COVID pandemic has not helped us. Let's be clear. All our initial plans with many physical events and a big launch all over Europe has had to be postponed. There is no way that we can do this now. But we think, and we totally agree with President Jair, with the honorable member of the council, that this will be an important exercise to get together, start discussing with an open mind, informing people, getting closer to the citizens, which will also help us to reduce this gap and this miscomprehension that is very often leads to this feeling of the citizens that the institutions are not there or are not reactive enough for them. So we hope that we can launch this exercise soon and that it can be as open as we want it, so that all citizens and all civil society organizations will be able to find their space and contribute. And to give a final reply to the question on the role of history that was addressed to me, I think the civil society organizations like yours will be the ones that will determine what will be the role of history, because we will, the European institutions will need to give a frame and then draw the results from this debate. But in order to reach out to all citizens all across Europe in every regions, we will not be able to do it alone. We need your help, we need your contribution as equal partners, and that's what we are trying to set up.
Thank you very much. I can promise you that both the Platform of European Memory Conscious and 62 our members organization, we are going to be deeply involved in this process. So thank you once more, Ms. Juknevičienė. Would you like to add something on the end of the discussion?
No, just to say again, thank you for invitation. And these discussions, I think, also helps us, all of us, to understand better, at least among the institutions on European Union and among the people. So I will try to do my best in my country, in my region, to convince many people to begin to think more European when we speak about history, not only to stay in our own bubble, how to say, of understanding. So I think it is most important when we speak about the future and when we look into the title of our conference.
Thank you very much. There is one still not answered question from our audience regarding Western Balkans and their complex historical experience, and the question if this will be a kind of obstacle in creating a common European narration. I would agree that, of course, those problems are to some extent even extreme, because they are deeply rooted in not only in the recent past, but also in other periods of our history. So that's why I think we should include in our efforts not only the historical experience of the current members of European Union, but also many other countries, like, for example, countries from Western Balkans, and also include them in our discussion. And of course, there is much more to be said, but our time is limited. Now, I would like to cordially thank our panelists, I'm sorry, for sharing with us very insights. So please do not disconnect. Stay with us during our virtual coffee break. Big thanks to our audience, both those who connected via Zoom and those who followed us on Facebook. Then conference will resume at 11:30 with the panel titled "What are the methods, the instrument, the institutions for the true European narration?" Thank you very much once more, and see you soon during the next panel.
Thank you. Yes, I was unmuted. So yes, the question is utmost important. I have no clear answer for today as a representative of Lithuania. So I would like to have the same understanding in Germany, France, and other countries. They are utmost important, I think, to have this. Maybe after Western Balkans, when Western Balkans will be accepted as part of European Union, maybe then it will be a new situation with the Eastern Partnership countries, and maybe we will look forward. But on the other hand, I have to admit that after Belarus, we see in Belarus this revolution for democracy. When we see election results in Moldova and other countries. Today, I think that Putin is not forever and his regime is not forever, and democracy and democratic processes will go forward, and I will see in my lifetime different Russia as well. I believe that Russians also are able to live in democracy. So this is the only way what we can do to support people in Belarus, Ukraine, other countries, and civil society in Russia itself.
Okay, thank you very much.
So then here, first I would like to say thank you for the first panel. And as it was already pointed out by Mrs. Zhukhnevicienne before, by the question on how this new European narrative could be pointed out, this leads us directly to the second panel. I will discuss the question, what are the methods, the instruments, the institutions for a true European narrative? And for that, I will be your moderator for that debate. So I'm a French-German researcher at the Collège des Bernardins and a former scholar of the Adenauer Foundation. But more important for that panel, we could convince three people. We are very proud to welcome them here. First is Alain Lamassoure, who is the counselor to the Council of Europe. He was from 1999 to 2019 member of the European Parliament, and from 2009 to 2014 chairman of the Budget Committee. And very important, he was initiator of the Project HOPE, where we will know more later on. Second, we can welcome Monika Karani-Auskaite, who is senior historian researcher at the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania. So her work is mainly on criminal law and criminal justice in Lithuania and in the Soviet Union after 1970. And third, we can welcome Constanze Itzel, who is since 2017 museum director of the House of European History in Brussels, where she was already since 2011, where she started as curator and project leader at the first special exhibition in the House of European History. And she works a lot with the imagery of the mosaic to describe the European history. And maybe later we can find that picture back in the debate where we will try to understand better on how this European narrative can be implemented. So I think the best is if we start right away. So it will be a pleasure. And also here, take care to the 15 minutes. So it will be the same principle as before. So everybody has 15 minutes to present his or her own ideas. And later on, it's open for the debate that everybody can discuss better all the ideas of that. So Alain Lamassoure, it would be a pleasure to hear you.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear and see me? Because I can't see me.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. I can see me. I see you and I can hear you, but I can see me. Good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be invited to this important conference, and it's my pleasure to meet again, unfortunately remotely, some good friends, particularly among the organizers in the Collège of Bernardin, Antoine Arjakovsky. So, as you understand, and you rightly recalled, dear friend, I am neither an historian nor an academic. I am a politician. And as a minister of European Affairs and MEP, I traveled across the highways and byways of the continent for 40 years. And let me come to my point. Over the last decade, all over Europe, we have witnessed the emergence of brand new populist, extremist, nationalist, often racist political parties, and the resurgence of brutality, uncouthness, mendacity, hatred in political rhetoric. Admittedly, every country is a case of their own. However, building on my own experience, I wondered whether here or there, a poor or biased way of teaching history could have been one of the reasons for this worrying development. Last year, to prepare for the French rotating presidency of the Council of Europe, I was commissioned by the French government sorry, to report on the state of play of history teaching in school all over the continent, from Iceland to Russia, and from Sweden to Portugal and Armenia. The whole French diplomatic and cultural network was put at my disposal. Let's be candid, the overall picture is bleak. In more than half of the European states, what is taught as history sounds like a nationalist propaganda, as it was the case everywhere in the world before 1939. As expected, in the front row, unfortunately, we find all the countries affected by a so-called frozen conflict. There are a dozen of them, by the way. Most, but not all, on the eastern and southern borders of Europe. The most appalling cases are Bosnia, and more surprisingly, Northern Ireland, as it was rightly recalled in the first roundtable this morning. In these countries, to paraphrase Clausewitz's famous words, history is a continuation of war by other means. Resentments are kept burning on a slow fire to make sure that old hatreds are transmitted or handed over to the younger generations. And it works. Those who fought earlier this month in Nagorno-Karabakh were not born during the previous war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the 90s. It's the first category of countries. In another category, the situation is the opposite. Not only is national propaganda meticulously avoided, but to avoid taking any chances, any narrative is held in suspicion. What is called history is a canon bringing together, for instance, 50 in the case of the Netherlands, or 29 in Denmark, very different themes, transverse themes of the past, not related to each other, without chronology, featuring unknown characters, and paying close heed to the latest political correctness, running the risk of judging the past with the different high ethical standards of today. The history, which should be a film, a movie, is downgraded into a motionless and emotionless photograph. The outcome of this approach is hardly less appalling. For instance, last March in the UK, according to a poll concerning youngsters aged between 16 and 29, for 26% of the respondents, the Second World War pitted France against Great Britain, and Waterloo was a battle of that war. For most of the others, Waterloo was only a song by the Swedish music group ABBA. For 21% of the respondents, they were not aware that the United States took part in the war. And for 12%, the Second World War ended in the 60s, possibly inspiring the Beatles' Yellow Submarine. And there is a third category of member states. Fortunately, the situation there is less detrimental. It's the case, for instance, in Germany, in the 16 Länder of Germany, in Portugal, most of Spain, not in the Basque Country, not in Catalonia, in Italy and in France. In these countries, there is a less biased or non-biased narrative without prejudice to specific themes as well, and taking due account of political correctness. But even there, nobody bothers to assess the average level of knowledge in history of the new citizens when they come of age. What is to be done? You may find me too optimistic, but my bet is that in today's world, no country, no leader can afford to get too bad a name for too long among too many audiences at home and abroad. And the current state of play is only possible because nobody is aware of it, apart from a few insiders. Policymakers and historians themselves have a dim view of how history is taught to pupils and students in their country, and they know nothing, if they care, of what is happening beyond the borders. Consequently, I advocated a dual approach. First approach, the observatory, the setting up of a European observatory of history teaching at school. After 2 years of endeavor, it has just seen the light of day last Thursday. This conference is particularly timely. A first batch of 17 countries are the founders under and within the legal and political framework of the Council of Europe. The aim is to resume, to complement, to improve the establishment of the state of play, the survey I carried out last year as a first primer. To collect all relevant information about history teaching, place of history in the curricula, elaboration and content of the syllabuses, regulations on textbooks, training and recruitment of teachers, assessment of the performances, etc. Once collected, the presentation of information will be translated and harmonized with a view to facilitating comparisons. And the whole table will be released every 2 or every 3 years in a solemn event. It will be just a photograph, a picture, without any quality comment. Second arm, the debate. Upon this unbiased, hopefully unbiased basis, made available to the general public everywhere at the same time, let the debate start. And we are now preparing for 3 simultaneous circles of debates. The first circle of academies, through the network All European Academies. For our purpose, academies, national, royal, or republican academies, are relevant twice, because being ancient, they are highly estimated, and their members being co-opted, they are independent from the powers that be. Second circle, universities, and on top of the list, the Civica network, awarded the title of European Academy by the European Commission last year. And third circle, the NGOs in the broadest sense, the Museum of European History, dear Constance, the Houses of Europe, the European Movement, and the numerous think tanks and platforms interested in history and European matters, like the Collège des Bernardins, of course. The simple fact of browsing over the output of the observatory will trigger a host of questions. For instance, why is history teaching compulsory in some countries and only optional there? Why is history absent at primary school level in Germany, in Austria and Estonia, and mandatory only at primary level in the Republic of Ireland? Why are textbooks free of writing and publishing in France and in northern countries, while submitted to registration in many other countries and limited to 1 or 2 mandatory textbooks in half a dozen countries? How come that in half the member states of the EU, the European founding fathers and the main stages of the European construction are banned from the contemporary history chapters. At a recent webinar a few days ago, staged by the History Center of Sciences Po, Paris, Marc Lazare, its chairman, told us that among 20 students of a second master year classroom, only one of them, 1 out of 20, knew the names of Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman. From all these academies, universities, NGOs, we can expect a lot of publications, comments, recommendations, assessment. It's not up to the observatory to give grades, but I would be very surprised if nobody was tempted among them to grant good marks or preferably bad marks. And of course, it would be of paramount interest with developments and hopefully progress, so hinted, encouraged, urged, fostered, sparked by all these recommendations and discussions in some parts of the continent. Last question, will we come up with a European narrative in the end? Not yet. Could the European narrative play the same role as the national narrative played in the construction of modern nations? I did believe it, definitely, once. But now, at the risk of disappointing you, but for the sake of the debate, I would say that I have my doubts. To mention but one reason, one single reason, irrefutable, unfortunately, aiming at a common European history at school would be politically unrealistic. Not one single country, starting with mine, France, would deem any international outfit or any bunch of multinational academics whosoever legitimate to draw up such a common narrative. Which means that, at least at school level, secondary education, we are condemned to live with dozens of different narratives, each mentioning in its way the history of Europe or not. What can we at least demand from this narrative? 3 requirements perfectly in line with the resolution adopted last year by the European Parliament and which was presented earlier this morning in the first roundtable of the conference. First, an account based on facts, a narrative based on facts, historical facts substantiated by history science. Second, to read and to listen to other narratives, the narratives of others, to cross the looks. Let me take just 2 examples. First example, the 11th of November 1918, we commemorated last week. This event inspired very different and even conflicting memories in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Hungary, in Romania, and so on. Second example, the 8th and 9th of May 1945. In the UK, in the western part of the continent, and in Moscow, we commemorate every year the victory against Nazism and the end of the worst ordeal ever in history. But if you live in Warsaw, in Prague, Bratislava, or Bucharest, on that day, your grandfathers switched from one barbarian and totalitarian regime for another. So the way out is not striving to agree on the same presentation everywhere, but to take into account other sensitivities and my neighbor's memory. My nation is the center of my world. It's not the center of the world. And the third requirement is to take pains at ensuring that from all these numerous different national narratives emerges the profound sentiment of a common European conscience. a sentiment of belonging to a same civilization, a huge melting pot of memories, religions, philosophies, values, discoveries, progress, success and mistakes, which sets us apart from anybody elsewhere, be it from China, India, the Muslim world, from Africa, or even the US. In conclusion, after 70 years of the European construction, our peoples are reconciled, at least inside the European Union. Nobody, nowhere, even the most extremist parties, contemplate fears or hopes for a fresh war between, say, Spain and Portugal, France and Germany, Italy and Austria, Poland and Lithuania, Hungary and Romania. We are living in Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace. But there is nothing perpetual under the sun. If we want to have peace deeply rooted in the hearts and minds for the next century, we must also secure the reconciliation of memories. The European narrative will come out of peace, enshrined in national narratives made mutually compatible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very impressive and deep insight on how we could make it, and also a vision for many different European countries. And it was also a wonderful last sentence. Especially at the and she is contributing to.
Tobias,
yes,
we cannot hear you very well. Maybe have the microphone closer to you. Thank you.
Maybe is it now better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so basically, I was just saying, we just heard Alain Lamassoure, and it was just a wonderful finish to hear that the necessity of the research center, the reconciliation with the past. And now it's a pleasure to hear Mrs. Karaniaus-Kaite from the Historic Research Center at the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania.
So, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to be here and a big honor, of course. Do you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, so I'll try to start with my slides. And I'm doing this for the first time, so I hope shared screen will work on Zoom. Okay. Is it working or not yet?
So far, not. So far, it doesn't.
Okay, I put host disabled share screening. Maybe you could enable my screen sharing.
I tried to name you co-host. If
it's not possible, then it's fine. I can just talk without slides. If that's too difficult, it's just let me know.
Maybe we can just try it now, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Yeah, let's try for the last time. Okay. Now it should work, actually.
Great.
Yes, I guess you see my screen, right? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, personal and shared memories are essential for the formation of an authentic human identity, and they shape emotional and intellectual capabilities and help answer the question who we are as individuals and communities. And in today's world, we are facing the situation that, again, the history and memory becomes essential and important. We are not talking anymore about the end of history. The famous phrases of Francis Fukuyama said in the early 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed, and even the popular culture today is discussing what will be our future as human beings. Will the artificial intelligence have a memory, or will it care about the memory? So it seems that memory is a hot topic all over the world. And According to memory studies theorist William James Booth, memory can be the weak flame of the struggle to remember, or the stable enduring habits acquired over long durations of relationships. It has sustained a traditionalism in politics, but it has also been a weapon of liberation and a recognition of those who have been silenced or otherwise wronged. And memory is the core of reconciliation and reconstruction. It has been used to justify great crimes. Yes, that's true. We know it very well in Europe, but we live surrounded by memory in our habits, names, places, everyday lives, artifacts, and so on. So as this scholar Booth continues, memory is essential to the coherence and enduringness of the community, to its boundaries and persistence, in short, to its identity. Memory is a ground of imputation of the society as owner of its past and responsible for it, as well as identical to and thus capable of making commitments to a future. And because we are members of a persistent and accountable community, I hope we all believe this, that we bear that witness. That is, we seek to ensure through acts of memory a certain persistence of the crime, the victim, and the perpetrator. Identity, justice, and memory thus emerge as tightly interwoven. So justice is another core factor of memory and politics of memory. So memory defines the political community as the accountability of groups for their past and the group's responsibility for future members. That's how the memory somehow draws the line between us today and past members of our community and the future members of our community as Europeans. And Booth also rephrases Aristotle, taking into account the problem of guilt, which is, I guess, also one of the central problems in the memory of Europe, a problem that is essential to us and particularly painful in Eastern and Central European memory today. And he talks about guilt, legal or moral, and what he calls constitution as a tool for accountability. Constitution is international law tools like human rights tools and so on. Personal accountability for the past crimes of members of today's community, according to Booth, are probably barbaric, but there is institutional and moral accountability. Therefore, according to him, even John Paul II apologized for the Crusader sack of Constantinople in the Middle Ages. And so that's how the past relates to us today. And another point which this scholar is trying to draw our attention on is that as the community, we should seek to investigate and perceive the vestiges of wrong done, to keep the victims and perpetrators in the light of remembrance, and to have their new past faiths and deeds represented in the judicial forum. Also central is the related duty to remember that doing justice fulfills a responsibility to a community, a right across time and to its members, past, present, and future. And he also uses a metaphor of home as a place of shared memory. Memory can reside in places, ones that are intermingled with the inhabited time of human relationships, and it is to be found in myriad of other forms of group memory, such as anniversaries, remember stories, material repositories of memory, and archives and other forms. And one example is, for instance, the 23rd of August, a day of remembrance of the victims of all totalitarian and authoritarian regimes in Europe, which is getting more and more awareness of in European different countries and communities. And there is probably one problem which I come from academic discourse, and sometimes I notice myself that in Western Academy there is what I would call some sort of academic, maybe colonization of mind. For instance, in the United States, there are scholars who claim that they would not even read the historiography and involve it in their research because that historiography of Eastern Europe is somehow not important, or less important at least. So I think there is this problem that somehow many young European countries, including my own country, once they chose to go towards the European perspective, they somehow tried to copy so much that European and Western forms of remembrance that they failed to find their own way to understand what happened in their own countries, all the crimes against humanity, genocide and other crimes, and therefore they imitated Western forms of remembrance, sometimes without really understanding how your own community could contribute to understanding justice and remembrance of those crimes. So what I would propose is to seek, first of all, academic debates within different European nations, ethnic groups, and so on, and without excluding smaller European countries from these debates, and at least trying to hear their perspective. But of course, that whole discussion must be shaped by main European values, such as democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, and so on, not to go into extremist nationalistic views. That's another danger. So somehow to balance this discussion, academic discussion. Of course, what we could do here is to search for new patterns and forms to deal with Eastern and Central European traumas, because I think sometimes Eastern and Central European countries are still not aware how traumatized those societies were and still are by Nazism and communism and authoritarian regimes. And to raise the question, is there a discussed colonization of Western scholar discourse? Is there such a fact? And if yes, how could we overcome this colonization and impose some sort of decolonization in academic debates of memory? And we should think about including not only the conflicts over memory between nations, ethnic groups, between the East and West, but within European nations, ethnic groups and citizens. Here, including the forgotten, unrepresented victim groups, is very essential and important as a part of memory decolonization. And for example, is the Roma genocide, which is, at least in some countries, still some forgotten phenomena, but what was a very brutal crime against humanity. So, and my own country and my own institution did something together with the platform to talk about this memory. Of course, building the places of memory is one more aspect, but the following speaker will speak more about this. And I don't know, about the school programs, maybe to have fully all school programs European is not realistic, but to have at least some sort of education, formal education, I think it's also important to letting understand each other better. And of course, the informal education is very important, and projects where young and older European generations can meet together from different countries and reveal their experience and understanding of the past of authoritarian regimes, someone from Spain discussing with someone from Croatia, for instance. I think it's a very good way of sharing and understanding each other. And yes, of course, the attempts to impose the shared justice and the rule of law is another aspect. Part of the problem in Eastern Europe is still the fact that in many cases there was no justice for communist and state socialist regimes, crimes and violence, sometimes even for the crimes of the Holocaust. Even the Nazi regimes, for instance, perpetrators were not always prosecuted because those countries were not democratic after the Second World War. For instance, GDR was the case sometimes. And in this, it is difficult to claim for reconciliation when there is no justice, legal, or if it's not possible, at least some symbolic sort of justice. There is one example of success. Here is the project by the Platform of European Memory and Conscience called the Justice #2, and it attempts to bring the justice for the victims that tried to break through the Iron Curtain to the West and were killed at the border, and has some successful result in imposing justice to those cases. And of course, the next thing would be, the next method to build that shared European narrative would be the citizenship and symbols. One more strategy for building the narrative is creating new symbols, places of memory and memorials of shared European memory, such as the symbols. Such symbols of today, as historian Timothy Snyder believes, enable the reality of tomorrow. But he also warns that make sure that such symbols include your fellow citizens. And in European context, the very symbol of shared European citizenship, I think, acquires new meanings. Here, we need to search for definitions of European citizenship that do not exclude or deny the national ones, but can be used as a tool of shared value of European identity. Well, we should also talk about the aspect of the generations in building this shared European narrative, that, for instance, different generations have different imaginations or representations of the past. And for instance, in Lithuania, there is a debate between younger and older generation, how the tragic past should be represented, what should we focus on traumatizing experiences, for instance, or on the successful victory of democracy. And I think that the generation is also one of the factors why these so-called memory wars sometimes happens, that we don't listen to the people of other generations and we don't want to understand their perspective. It's a little bit the same as not listening, not trying to involve yourself into the debates of different people with the different political views. Very sensitive topic today is the phenomenon of the history and memory wars. It is, on the one hand, an ongoing reality today in many countries, including the USA. We see it all, of course, in the mass media, Australia and Europe. But so on the one hand, it is a fact that such debates and wars exist. On the other hand, it's dangerous to impose this military language against your own fellow European citizenships and have this whole militarization of the discourse. So we shouldn't just take bad examples and increase the polarization of Europe in that way. One more example is the shared European public sphere, which a scholar says is failing, but I still have hope that it's possible to build something like that. And of course, there are risks of not pursuing the historical truth of polarization and populism. And I think those risks we should always take into account when we talk about the politics of memory and the politics of history. Because as wrote again Snyder, I will quote him, authoritarianism, and in our case, the end of our European project begins when we can no longer tell the difference between the true and the appealing. And also Timothy Snyder had criticized in one debate that we only share memories and care about memories, but facts is the framework to shape all these coexisting and sometimes conflicting memories in one historical truth. So science and facts as a way to resist post-truth and polarization and populism. So the European project of the shared memory will not work if all groups are not represented. We need a pluralistic dialogue instead of silencing the smallest and non-represented ones, not talking about the states, but also about the communities within the states and even the communities who doesn't have the national states. We need to deal with traumas of the past to recognize and include the colonized memory of Eastern European nations in the shared European narrative, of course, not excluding the Western perspective. And as Snyder stressed in 2019, as I mentioned already in one debate in Estonia, all the stories of success in Europe are the stories of collective success. So only together we can be successful as a community of shared memories and to build this narrative. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mrs. Karin Jauskaite. I think now we got a deep insight on how or what is important when we think about our history, when we think about the importance of the history of everybody in Europe. And now actually we just have one question remaining. How do we communicate this? How can we make this, put this in place? For instance, if we think about a museum, how would you communicate this to the European citizens, people who actually live as a citizen? And therefore, it's a pleasure to listen to Mrs. Itze, who I think will present us her view on the points here.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Standard question. I hope I can keep your attention for some minutes before lunch. So thank you very much for having invited me to speak. It's a great honor and pleasure to meet some of you again here in this context. I'm going to speak to you, trying to answer the question that you put up in the conference panel by speaking about the experience in having set up the House of European History over the past 11 years, first as a curator and then as its director. And not only setting it up, but also listening to the comments and observing the visitors as we have experienced since the last 3 years. So speaking about Europe, as has already been mentioned before, always means squaring the circle. Some of the problems of speaking about Europe have been mentioned, such as that Europe is not a fixed entity, and therefore it needs to be constantly renegotiated. Experiences of historical events can be extremely different across Europe, whether you look at them from the perspective of a victim or a perpetrator, to name but two of them. We all know a lot about contested histories, memory conflicts, and it has been mentioned that this can be true even within one country, Spain has been mentioned, but we can also see this in Belgium. The ways of looking at the past are very different, and even because I'm speaking about a museum, the methodology of museums of recent history across Europe is very different, and the visual and spatial language that they talk are very different. The target audience is very hard to define. With the millions of Europeans only in the EU, it is very hard to define which community you talk to. And then, as has been mentioned, also the knowledge about history is, of course, very limited. And even within one country, it can be catastrophic. But imagine at European level, that has also already been mentioned also, how few things people actually know about each other. And so making a museum like ours really has to square the circle between the complexity of the topic and the almost non-existing prior knowledge of the visitor. So this is what I mean by squaring the circle. So to try to answer your question, I've just summarized our experiences in 6 short points. I think that institutions or methodologies for speaking about Europe should be transparent in their methodology, critical, complex, fact-based and responsible, multi-perspective and open-ended. And I will just try to explain what I mean by that. So transparent about the methodology, that's what we try to do in the first space of our permanent exhibition, where we explain the concept of interpretation and the fact that a historical narrative is a construction, that any presentation of history is a selection. And so we question the concepts of heritage and memory in a critical way, and we ask the visitor to think about that. And being transparent for me also means explaining who speaks and with which motivation. So in our case, as we are a museum funded by the European Parliament, it is important to point out that our narrative was not made by political actors with specific political goals, but by academic historians and museum curators. And to make this transparent, we have published a book explaining how and by whom this museum was made and under which circumstances. And thereby we acknowledge that a different team in a different context would have made probably a very different exhibition and could still do so. I mean, we don't have to remain the only museum about this topic. Second point, critical. And by critical, I mean 2 things. First of all, stimulating critical thinking in the audience, but also looking at the past in a critical way. And on the first point, I've also already mentioned that our exhibition texts contain questions to the visitors, trying to stimulate them to make up their own minds. And we have developed different discursive formats for our events in which different positions are explained. And all our learning materials for schools work with the concept of critical discussion of what is shown. And on the second point, the critical examination of history, as I have already mentioned, there are very different traditions around Europe of dealing with history. Some countries rather adapt a celebratory approach, and the history of their country is full of heroic deeds and victorious battles. Other countries have come to examine their history in a more self-critical way, notably when their history is full of crimes, as in the case of my own country. However, given that there are gray zones everywhere and that good and evil don't stop at one border, I think it's very useful to discuss in Europe and to try to agree upon a common methodology of dealing with the past, both with its dark sides as well as with its good sides. Third point, complex. Europe is an extremely complex topic that defies simple definitions. Therefore, I think that any narrative about Europe cannot claim conveying a simple truth, but needs to address complexity. And now for the creation of our museum, how to do this? As I've mentioned, when we did surveys, as did Alain Lamassoure, before the opening of the exhibition, and we realized how there is absolutely sometimes no prior knowledge of history at a national level, but let alone at European level. So how to present a simple narrative, understandable for laymen, and at the same time take into account the complexity of the topic. So we start by explaining, and many of you probably have seen the exhibition, that Europe is a concept that cannot be fixed, definitely, and not even geographically, and that how Europe has been seen and defined depends on the time period and the geographical standpoint of the beholder. And we question also how the visitor sees it. So from the outset, it is clear that this exhibition does not present one simple truth that can just be consumed and be used like that. How to address the complexity of different situations in every country. This is also a very, very difficult thing to do. One way the museum does it is a juxtaposition of objects and films from multiple countries, from around 300 lenders. And this European collection is a unique panorama, and the only one, for example, where a Belgian visitor can see Polish documents, for example. So I think it's absolutely unique that it allows seeing Central Eastern European history in Western Europe. And I think this kind of presentations should happen more often. The exhibition also offers different micro-narratives, themes recurring across the chronological outline, which allow for a visit according to certain themes, for example, the history of European integration, but also topics such as protest movements, migration, the history of democracy, human rights, international law, and other themes. And this, I think, allows for confronting experiences, as the speaker before me has stressed, for example, of similarities of living under totalitarian regimes, albeit in very different countries. So micro-narratives is one of the approaches. And then sometimes we go explicitly into presenting conflicting or even opposing views on several topics. For example, on EU on enlargements, on the introduction of the euro, or even on the ways of dealing with the Shoah past. And this, I think, this approach could be even pushed further, and that's what we are exploring at the moment, by explicitly showing different interpretations of the same event, as it is done in several different history textbooks. I think this would be useful for our museum to point out these different ways even more explicitly in our narrative. The fourth point, fact-based and responsible. Our narrative also shows that Europe is shaped not only by history, but also by the images that different generations have of Europe, by visions that they had about the continent. So I think that institutions creating European narratives have a special responsibility as they contribute to shaping the image of Europe, of its past, but also of its present and future. And from this, I conclude that all narratives have to be fact-based and based on academic research methods as far as possible. And here we come to the more practical problems that we have encountered when developing the museums. As most of you know, most of the historiographical literature is to a large majority still very national or looks at countries from very limited perspectives. And sometimes we have encountered disappointing discoveries when a book promises the history of migrations in Europe, and then it's only about 3 big Western European countries, whereas we were looking for transnational views of the whole of Europe. So this is not to mention the complexity of reading the literature in different languages. We have 18 nationalities in our team, but still reading all literature is of course, and researching in museum databases is of course a very, very difficult thing to do. And there's a lot of teamwork needed to help out each other, for example, to search in a Polish database, even when the Polish curator will not be dealing with the topic in question. So it's a teamwork that is needed. Multi-perspective, any institution speaking about Europe, I think, should be developed taking different views into account. Because of the complexity of the topic, because the audience is so diverse. So any narrative, I think, should be produced in an international and interdisciplinary way. Here, in our case, this was 52 people working within the museum team throughout the development phase in the team, but on top of those, we need to count the designers and producers, the architects conceiving the building, the academic committee, the board, and the 100 translators to provide the 24 language versions, who of course influence the final product because they will determine which historical terms will be used for the different languages. And then I think you can all imagine how difficult the negotiations were about what to put in that space. And sometimes it meant fighting for space for a certain topic and against each other in the team. And I think also the comments that have been made about our exhibition show the same kind of dilemma, that is a very limited space and the topic is huge. And so the most widespread type of comment that we receive is that about everything that is missing in the exhibition. So I think we need more institutions like ours. What we have not managed to do, I think, and this is a self-critical remark, is to add immigrant voices. I think we have more or less come to an agreement of how to reconcile certain national narratives or create a transnational narrative out of that. But we could do more in adding voices of new Europeans. And then, of course, the interpretation should not be left to the curators only, but also visitors can interpret the exhibition. And here we have, for example, carried out events, for example, remembering 1918, where we invite visitors to guide in the exhibition. So they all guide it according to their own narratives. Some told a very national narrative, some told their family history, and some told a European story. And this means that the exhibition is open to interpretation, and also all these levels are intertwined. National history is part of European history, family history is interconnected as well. So I think this refers very nicely to what Alain Lamassoure has said about listening to each other's narratives when the exhibition space is being opened up for various voices to speak about history. And then for me, I think the most relevant is, and I'm concluding, to become aware of the different interpretations and points of views through juxtaposing different narratives. I also think that we should never tell only one narrative at a time, although in a museum for the layman, we are in a way obliged to create one, but confront different narratives with each other. And this is why I really look forward to participating in the third circle mentioned by Alain Lamassoure. The sixth and last point, and very short, is that I think the museum should be open-ended, or any institution speaking about Europe should be open-ended, because Europe has never been something static and fixed. Its concept has been shaped by history and culture, and also by the image that contemporaries had of the continent. And therefore, I think the images of the past and the way we deal with the past are very important for the future. And therefore, I totally agree that those who will discuss the future of Europe should know its past. And we have suggested to offer special guided tours to the conference participants. That was when it was still planned to happen in Brussels. But I think that the museum should be open to interpretations. And we are now looking into different voices, into different ways of including more voices of visitors, evaluate the museum, and develop different spaces, also digital, to share, confront, compare, and debate these diverse narratives about Europe. And then with the input we receive from visitors and with the evaluation based on comments we have received, we will over time change and amend the museum, because the museum, a narrative as Europe, should constantly be developing and should constantly be changing, as is the continent. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to listen to you and to understand all the ideas and the concept on how to run a museum and all what is behind, to communicate all the history behind. So before I will open now the possibility to all the participants to ask questions, I would maybe let between our three panelists the opportunity to ask questions to each other. For instance, if this is Mr. Lamassoure, if you would be happy about your vision, how you organize the museum or not. I don't know, what are the questions you have to each other or reactions? Oh, we can't hear you, Mr. Lamassoure.
Thank you. Let me congratulate the other panelists. So I prefer, we are running out of time, and I prefer to let other participants to raise questions if they have.
Good. Okay, so then we have one question by Theun Jansen. So maybe you can just ask your question if there are from the panels.
Yeah, it's a question that can be addressed to everyone on the panel, because it's a very broad question. Because I mean, we're discussing now all of the different methods of attaining this European narrative, or at least to create the conditions for becoming, for the emerging. But I was wondering if at the basis of this is reconciling, different regional experiences with memory to get to this kind of social political communities in Europe, like this strengthening the solidarity basis. And we've talked about, for example, Mr. Lamassoure talked about 1945, the 9th of May as a conflicted day, because for Western Europe it means liberation. For Eastern Europe it means the beginning of another round of oppression, which took longer and was in some ways more structural. But what about the element there of, on that same date, the 8th of May, that the Sétif and Guelma massacre took place in Algeria? There's also this element of the colonial heritage and the colonial aspect of these conflicting memories, especially in countries like France or the Netherlands or Spain or the United Kingdom. So I was wondering, if we have also, like Timothy Snyder mentioned, this displaying symbols that include fellow citizens. And how do we then also include this colonial heritage and these citizens that come forth from this colonial, from these colonial ties? And how do we decolonize that memory transmission as well? So I was wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that.
Maybe what we will do is we will just collect a couple of questions, and then maybe you can combine all the questions. So, for instance, we have another question from Facebook to Mr. Lamassoure. And here, it is about building a common European history going to be one of the priorities of the French presidency of the Council of the EU. And then how can the French presidency prevent potential criticisms on imposing the French version of European history to others? And another question here from Mr. Jakowski, also to Mr. Lamassoure, what are the next steps for the HOPE institution? And I think the question before is also an interesting question for Mrs. Itzel, because I think you may have also some pressure from external participants. I think so far we have no other questions, so maybe we can just take those questions, and I'm looking forward to your answers.
Okay, may I try to ask at least three of the questions, if I understand correctly. First, colonial history is very interesting question, and of course, we must be inspired by the same spirit of reconcile memories. And we are trying to do it in France with Algeria, because you mentioned Algeria. The French president and his Algerian counterpart have entrusted two historians, one French historian, Benjamin Stora, who was Algerian born, by the way, but he's now French, and he pursued a French academic career, and an Algerian historian to exchange their views, to listen to the other narrative, and to try to alleviate all misunderstandings, misgivings, and to make progress towards possibly a common approach, or at least a way to better understand the other's view. And we did the same with Rwanda. The African state of Rwanda, which was not a French colony, it was a German one, then a Belgian one. But when there was a civil war, very bloody, and a genocide in Rwanda in 1994, France intervened to try to put an end to the genocide, but was accused by the current Rwandan authorities to have fostered and encouraged genocide. So to try to find a way, again, of reconciling memories, both presidents have set up a common team of historians from both countries to try to find also a way out. But you are right. And what we are doing at EU level with the observatory and all the other, the Museum of European History and all the other initiatives, including this conference, is far more important in Africa, for instance, because in Africa, there are 54 nation states represented in the United Nations, but most of them are states without being nations yet. And what can they teach to their students about the past of their nation, which hardly exists, of the states? Are they, given that there is no written archives in Africa, so will they limit the content of their narrative to colonization and decolonization, blaming, of course, European colonial countries? Well, it's a big question mark. And if we want to help them, we must first do our homework at home in Europe. Second question, about the French presidency of the European Union, due in spring 2022, not next year, but the year after. What could be the program, and will history teaching be part of the program? If there was this temptation among the French authorities, I would advise fiercely against. History is not a competence of the EU. And that's why I managed to set up this observatory in the framework of the Council of Europe, who is in charge of the handing over of values and history, not the EU. For the EU, it is a support competence through the Museum of European History, through Erasmus, of course, to exchange teachers and students, but the framework, the organization of education and let alone the curricula or syllabuses, are not at all within the sphere of competence of the EU. The EU has a lot to do in other very important and very current present issues. Well, I'm sure that France will have other priorities. And third, the third question, what could be our next step with this newborn observatory, which I mentioned with the acronym HOPE, a history observatory for peace in Europe? Well, the first next step will be to enlarge the membership, because there are only 17 of us, 17 countries, with a quantitative lack of members out of 47, it's not enough, and also a geographical shortage, geographical unbalance. The current membership represents the southern part of Europe, eastern part of Europe. So far, Germany is not yet full member. Politically they are warmly in favor, and they have expressed desire to join. But as you know, Germany is a federal state, and the competence are devolved to the 16 Länder, so they take time to take a final decision. I don't doubt that they will join, and all the more so since, as you know, we are now entering a German presidency of the Council of Europe, not of the EU, but of the Council of Europe. So they will take on the baby, if I may say so. And we lack participation so far of the northern member of the Council of Europe, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries, and their participation is all the more important than these countries have a very different approach from that of the major part of European countries. In these countries, history is taught more as an acquisition of competences, the competence of historians, than that an acquisition of knowledge. And of course, for me, the best plan would be to combine both. But they have very interesting things to say to the rest of Europe, particularly on teaching. And if you take, for instance, Finland or Sweden, in the PISA tests, which are conducted and released every 2 years, as you know, by the OECD, which concern not human science, not history, but hard science, mathematics, physics, chemistry, etc. These countries are deemed, judged better on top of the list, not only at European level, but worldwide. So they have a lot to teach to us. So my next step, our next step, will be to enlarge and to ensure that these important countries join the flock.
Great, thank you very much. So maybe I would like also to give the chance to Mrs. Itzel and Mrs. Karaniaoke to react.
Yes, should I start?
Sure.
Can you hear me? Yes. Just on the question asked by the platform colleague, a very practical and a theoretical answer. I think, so the theoretical answer, I think that the concept developed by Michael Rothberg of the multidirectional memory helps a lot. When he shows that the recognition of the victim of sufferings of one victim group, like for example in the case of the Holocaust, so the memory of the Holocaust has helped the recognition of victims of colonialism to have their sufferings also recognized. So I think this concept, I prefer this concept over the competition of memories, because I think it can be helpful and also applied very practically. And I think coming to our museum, I would like to express my gratitude for those academic articles that have already been written to analyze our narrative and what is missing. And notably also Timothy Snyder's view that the history of colonialism should be much more recognized when speaking about the history of European integration. So this will be in part of the documents that we will study when re-evaluating our exhibition and redoing our exhibition.
Great. Thank you. So, Mrs. Karnioki, do you have something to add, or would you just say that you're happy with that?
Yes, I'm all what was said. I just agree, and just one detail that the very concept of the concentration camp was developed in the colonies. So that says a lot, I think, as a symbol of this shared suffering. And I don't think that any group of victims should be forgotten in the context of European history. That's it, probably.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I think also here we see the importance of to include everybody, but also that not everybody can give the perfect answer. So I'm still very happy that you were all here, and really thank you for participating. Also, thank you for all the questions. Oh, Mrs. Itzel, did you raise your hand? No? Okay. All right. So yes. So again here, thank you very much. I just have a doubt about the rooms later. So maybe can I have a reaction if there are rooms later for discussion? Because I think. Okay. So I think there are rooms. There is yes. So we have the end right now. So again, it was really a pleasure. If you to see you back again tomorrow. Very happy to see you, and yeah, I hope you have a nice day, and also good luck with all the projects. We also will continue on our projects, and yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you.